The war on drugs meets the war on terror as Washington brings Colombia to Afghanistan. You are here on the map. On the map tonight, exporting U.S. counter-narcotics strategies from Colombia's highlands to Afghanistan's poppy fields. We ask one of the authors of that approach if a failed battle plan can work in new terrain. We have a special report following Afghan police at an elite training camp in the Colombian jungle. And blunt talk with NATO's Secretary General. Jaap de Hoop's heifer mounts a vigorous defense of how the war is being run. Hello, I'm Avi Lewis. Welcome to On the Map. Tonight, the other war in Afghanistan. One that gets far less attention, but will be the key battleground of the future. The war on drugs. Afghanistan's $3 billion a year opium industry makes it a drug-dependent economy, fueling Taliban warlords and government ministers alike. Now, and largely under the radar, the United States is in the first stages of exporting its patented war on drugs strategy from Colombia to Afghanistan. So the new U.S. ambassador in Kabul is the former ambassador to Colombia. He'll be overseeing the building of an $8 million counter-narcotics headquarters. The U.S. has brought Colombian elite drug police to Afghanistan to supervise training. The question is, what impact will the war on drugs approach have in Afghanistan? The fate of many lives, Afghan, Canadian, and others, is at stake. Later in the show, I'll put that question, and a couple of others, to the NATO Secretary General. But first, a report from Al Jazeera, taking you into the Colombian jungle for a behind-the-scenes look at a U.S.-funded counter-narcotics training facility and a visit from some special guests.
In the province of Tolima, Colombia, lies a training camp for special forces from all over the world. The country that produces 70% of the world's cocaine has become the most experienced in fighting narcotics. The press was given a first-time look at the camp and what the trainees learn here during their special operations exercises. Camp Pijao is supposed to be one of the toughest training grounds in the world. All exercises are done with real bullets. Training starts at 6 and ends at 9 p.m. every day. And Green Berets from the United States and commandos from Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador regularly visit the camp. The most recent pupils, however, were totally unexpected. 3 Afghan soldiers and their translator arrived here 3 weeks ago.
Actually, we've been explained about the training. He says we've explained about the trainings of the Colombia. More than that, we did not know anything. Only just narcotics.
Mohammed Yusufi, Najib Haidari, and Mohammed Parwit went into exile during the Taliban regime, but are now part of the Afghan police. They were chosen among hundreds to receive this special training, and in a few months they will use that training to destroy heroin labs and capture drug traffickers in their country, the world's #1 heroin producer. Following their vigorous training, the 3 Afghans will return to their country and train other members of what will become the first ever anti-narcotics police unit in Afghanistan, made up of 130 men. Mónica Villamizar, Al Jazeera, Tolima, Colombia.
That was a report from Al Jazeera. And now I'm joined by one of the authors of America's Approach in Colombia and a player in the current plans for Afghanistan. Andre Hollis is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Counter-Narcotics. He joins me from Washington. Andre Hollis, welcome to On the Map.
Thank you very much, Avi. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we've just seen extraordinary images of how the U.S. is bringing the Colombia-style war on drugs model to Afghanistan. You've been calling for the U.S. government to take the Afghan drug trade more seriously for years. What do you think of this approach?
It's very simple, Avi. The best security forces in the world in terms of dealing with narco-terrorists and ungoverned space and establishing sovereignty, such as the rule of law, are the Colombian security forces. Why? Because they've been doing it. They have a great deal of experience. They offer a great deal in terms of training and knowledge. And it's an honor, I think, to all of us, and a credit to the Colombians that they were willing to send folks to help in this very important narco-terrorist fight in Afghanistan.
Okay, so now you've managed to say narco-terrorist twice in one initial
Absolutely.
answer. That's a conflation which doesn't really correspond to reality. It's a convenient one that took place after 9/11. But Colombia's situation is much more complicated than that. You've got, like in Afghanistan, you've got drug traffickers among the paramilitaries. Paramilitaries now linked to the government, which is in crisis because of its links to drug trafficking right-wing death squads. So your conflation of narco and trafficking is just ideological.
Avi, you said a lot of things. Fortunately, none of them were based in fact. When I say narco-terrorist, I'm talking about two kinds of things. One, the drug trafficker who gives proceeds from trafficking to terrorist organizations. Two, the drug trafficker who has a pipeline, a criminal covert way to move product from point A to point B.
Well, you introduced facts. Let's talk about facts. Let's talk about the war on drugs, the American strategy in Colombia as an anti-drug strategy. Since 2000, $3 billion has been spent on anti-drug policies alone, in spraying crops, training special forces. At the end of all of that money, Colombia still produces 90% of all the cocaine consumed in the United States. Cocaine consumption has barely budged. Consumption has budged barely at all since 2000. The U.S. drug czar himself recently wrote a letter to a Republican senator admitting that prices and purity of cocaine are the same as they were in the early 90s when this strategy started. So this is the strategy that needs to be exported to Afghanistan?
Well, first and foremost, John Walters didn't say that. What he said was it has not markedly decreased as we had hoped. And you're right about the point about that particular indicia. The point that I would make to you, though, however, is that post 9/11, and I wrote the policy on this point, we changed our strategy from just one of counter-drug to more one of counter-trafficking and helping Colombia, which has the will and the identity to establish sovereignty and the rule of law through its ungoverned space.
I'm looking at a report here from the International Crisis Group, which is hardly the Noam Chomsky Research Center. The International Crisis Group says new armed groups are emerging that are the next generation of paramilitaries. Drug trafficking continues unabated. Massive illegal funds from drug trafficking help fuel the decades-long conflict. 4,000 trade unionists have been killed in Colombia in this period. 3 million peasants have been displaced from their land by war, and part of that war, of course, Plan Colombia and the anti-drug strategy. You're giving me a press release from the Uribe government, which is mired in scandal right now.
Well, I'm actually giving you something based upon my personal eyes-on view, having been down in Colombia more than 20 trips, and I doubt if you can attest to that. But more importantly, I put it in the context of where Colombia was 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago.
But the International Crisis Group report that I'm reading from is now.
I put it in the context of members of their Supreme Court who get assassinated in their Supreme Court because of the lack of effective sovereignty in Bogota only 10 years ago. So is it perfect? Of course not. Are there still problems? Of course there are. Is this a model for what Afghanistan needs? It's not a perfect model. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying, however, there are lessons learned, particularly from those in the Colombian security forces who have been doing this, that are applicable and can be helpful to Afghanistan.
Well, let's move to Afghanistan, because this is the subject really of our show today. How is the Colombian model going to work there? I think, one of the problems is that drug trafficking runs right through Afghan society, through the Taliban and the Afghan government. There was a classified list compiled by several U.S. agencies of the top 30 important drug suspects. At least 5 of them were in Karzai's government. In 2005, DEA agents in Afghanistan found 9 tons of opium in the office of the governor of Helmand province, but the team was blocked from taking any action against the governor because he had close ties to American, British military and diplomatic officials. So, this is like Colombia. Drug trafficking goes on both sides. You've got to deal with the government as much as the Taliban.
You are right, Avi, about the pervasiveness of drug trafficking throughout Afghanistan. The problem in Afghanistan is a very basic one at the initial level, which is, one, you have to establish elements of sovereignty throughout a country that hasn't had it for a generation. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, they are 50 years behind where the Colombians are. Number 2, drug trafficking is much more than just a law enforcement issue. Again, it goes to a security and justice issue.
Listen, Andre, the real question sort of hanging over this is why now? You know, the U.S. did nothing initially when Afghanistan was first invaded. Why is this happening now?
The U.S. government could have done a lot more starting in November of '01. I argue for that. That view was not accepted. They are now realizing after 4 years of mistakes that they need to do more. Having said that, ultimately, it has to come down to the political will of the Afghans. If the Afghans lack the ability and the will to establish sovereignty and to go after the drugs as well as the narco-terrorists, all the money in the world won't solve the problem. So first and foremost, it comes down to, and we cannot force or create Afghan will. That has to come from the Afghans.
Particularly when all the most powerful parts of society are benefiting and profiting massively from the opium, which is half the economy there.
Directly or indirectly, you're right.
Andre, thanks for